Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Leah Mix, CEO of Delphi. Today's guest occupies a rare intersection in the world of Ibogaine, one where traditional knowledge, clinical science, and global policy strategy converge in a single person. Jonathan Dickinson is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Ambio Life Sciences, one of the world's leading Ibogaine clinics, operating across Mexico and now Malta. He is a Mexico licensed psychologist, former executive director of the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance, and author of the field's foundational clinical safety guidelines. He holds the only active legal export license for Iboga from Gabon and has been initiated into two traditions of Bwiti, which is the spiritual lineage which Ibogaine originates. His peer-reviewed research spans addiction, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease. Jonathan's new book, Ibogaine and the Bicameral Mind, published this year, could be considered the first comprehensive work on Ibogaine, weaving together cultural, scientific, and philosophical dimensions of one of the most complex and consequential medicines emerging in our time. And at a moment when Ibogaine has been named in a White House executive order and the policy conversation is accelerating rapidly, there may be no better person to help us understand what's really at stake. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Dickinson. Jonathan, it's great to have you with us.
Hey, thank you, Leah, for the introduction. I'm happy to join you today.
Yeah, thanks so much. And as a side note, we've been so blessed to get to collaborate with you a bit on some projects within Delphi. And it's just such a delight for me to have an opportunity for your wisdom that we've got to see in action to be brought to this audience through the Delphi Insight session. So yeah, thanks again for being here. You've been initiated into two Bwiti traditions in Gabon. You wrote the field's first clinical safety guidelines years ago, and you hold the only legal Nagoya compliant export license for Iboga in the world. That's a very unusual combination of roles for one person to hold. So I wonder just if you could take us back, like how did this happen? How did someone, become all of that?
I think Ibogaine was always interesting to me because it brought together all these different threads. So I had personal experience healing with psychedelics. I'd had a hard time coming off of antidepressants and had really bad withdrawal, and psychedelics helped me. So I was really passionate about what they could do. And at the time, the only sort of tangential work was in drug policy and advocacy. And I was working with an organization in Canada that was involved in lobbying for student rights around drug policy. It's called the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And at the time, it was mostly conversations about the supervised injection sites that were just opening for the first time in the west side of Canada. There was a study that had come out about prescription heroin that showed that people's addictions stabilized when they were given access to a stable supply. And so there was a lot of conversations going around in the harm reduction space. And so that was an education that I received while I was trying to bring psychedelics into a conversation amongst policymakers in Canada. So at some point, somebody pointed me towards Ibogaine because it occupied those two worlds. But I was also, having grown up in Canada, I had opportunities to go and sit in sweat lodges and vision quests and pipe ceremonies and the Red Road type of path with Algonquin communities here. And so the fact that Iboga came from a traditional lineage and had a whole scholarly kind of traditional knowledge surrounding it was also one of those threads. So I think that's why I gravitated in many directions to be involved with all the different sides of Iboga and all the different contexts where it lives.
Yeah, it's really incredible how your path has unfolded and how you've been able to bring all of these different pieces together. And I think that's really part of what you're book is, right? It's bringing all of this wisdom that you've been gathering over these years into kind of one resource to share with the field. It's a very interesting framing. The title of the book is Ibogaine and the Bicameral Mind. And that title references Julian Jaynes, a fairly niche philosopher of consciousness. So, out of curiosity, what made that framework the right lens for this medicine? And what does it help us understand that maybe purely clinical language can't?
Yeah, I guess if people don't know anything about Julian Jaynes, he was a Princeton scholar, and his big theory was that consciousness has been sort of uniquely recent evolution in the human story, like in the last 3,000 years or so, and that prior to that, and there was a sort of a transition, but prior to that, people experienced this bicameral mind, which means there's two chambers in the mind. And so one would be where the experience and identity would be anchored, and the other one would be where novel problems were solved and worked out. And sometimes that information would arrive to people as a voice that would speak to them. And so he was attempting to help to explain the way that early literature, like Homer's work in ancient Greece and other literature prior to the modern era was structured and how it described things in relationships with genies and spirits and gods and historical religious experiences, how they were structured, and to try to make sense of that, right? So was really a kind of ancient problem-solving mechanism where people didn't necessarily need to be conscious or visualizing and navigating through problems the same way that we do now. They would be engaging in routine or traditional work and something somewhat repetitive. But when novel or stressful situations would arise, this bicameral mechanism would kick in and try to provide a solution. And so that would appear like some kind of divine intervention. And for me, it came at a time when I was trying to grapple with just like raw data of the Ibogaine experience and the stories that I'd heard. Because after spending years working around it really closely and talking to patients and having my own experiences with it, I would read the scientific literature and realize that people weren't really describing actually very much. Like, for example, people talk about this kind of buzzing sound, but when you actually hear people describe it, it's actually quite complex. It's often spatially oriented somewhere around them. It's often like moving or doing something or vibrating somehow. And so it is a little bit more than just like a tinnitus in the ear. So I just got really curious about those kinds of discrepancies. And the bicameral mind helped to describe this feeling in Ibogaine where people remain well anchored to a sense of self, but there's often this other thing that is presented to them. And sometimes it's just images, or sometimes they seem like they're shown in a specific way that they're informing or guiding, but it can be to the point of actually having a conversation with a voice. So it seems very bicameral in that sense. So I thought that was helpful.
Yeah, I think it provides a frame to expand the conversation in ways that it really couldn't or hasn't been approached before. And what comes to my mind is the work of Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, which he wrote that book in 2011 and won a Nobel Prize for it, which kind of brings more scientific evidence actually to this philosophy of the bicameral mind. So it's a really interesting frame. And perhaps that is part of how the discussion around the experience of Ibogaine and the mechanisms of Ibogaine can be framed moving forward so we can have a kind of a more robust conversation about it.
I hope so, because I don't think that psychiatry has a really firm handle on how it should work or how it should diagnose what's going on for people. Right now, we have these clusters of symptoms that get diagnosed as depression or post-traumatic stress disorder obsessive compulsive disorder. But oftentimes you can have people presenting with completely different sets of symptoms that, because they meet enough of the criteria, get grouped together. And so there's also not a lot of kind of understanding about how other elements come in to shape that, like the environment or transitions in people's lives. Anyways, I think that psychiatry is really attempting to transition into neurological science or more of a medical science, but it's still stuck in kind of an old form of medicine where we're just diagnosed based on symptoms. And we don't do that in other areas of medicine anymore. And so I think Ibogaine is pushing us to look at neurological underpinnings of some of the challenging conditions that we look at. But I think it's also worth understanding what it's doing in the mind and how it could be helping people to work through problems. And that it's probably valuable for us to look at that raw data instead of just trying to fit Ibogaine, which is very complex, into this old, sort of outdated framework.
Exactly. We want to talk a little bit more about that tension, but maybe we could take a little stepping stone into it. Ambio is treating people with addiction, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and other conditions. And you've published peer-reviewed research on all of it. So for someone that is newer, maybe to Ibogaine, or just those of us who want to understand a little bit more deeply that component of how it's working, what is it doing in the brain that makes it such a wide range of conditions responsive to it? That's a component piece. And then this other piece, of course, about how it's affecting the mind itself. But that first.
Yeah, I thought it was useful to push in the direction of really objective neurological conditions that we could point to because it helps to frame Ibogaine as a medicine. And we do have frameworks that are fairly robust for how would you diagnose conditions like Parkinson's and MS, and we're getting better at things like mild traumatic brain injury and things like that. So that's something where we're able to step out of the realm of psychiatry and have this objective basis. And so it's easier to do research, and placebos less of a confounder and that kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons why we push in that direction. It's also just really fascinating because there aren't a lot of treatments. But I think we have these early signals. We don't really understand exactly everything that Ibogaine is doing. It's very complex and it's doing a lot at the same time. But some of the early stuff that caught my attention was some research on Ibogaine's effect on cellular metabolism. And so its ability to change how cells would turn oxygen and glucose into energy. And in the process, they could just function better. When you take Ibogaine, there's initial sort of dip because cells have stored up energy in different chemical forms, like ATP is one of these forms. This will burn up all of this store of energy in the cell, but then it converts that energy into this action of then improving the efficiency of how it metabolizes energy in the future. So it becomes better at doing what it's doing. And one of the early studies found that even in yeast, so it wasn't happening just on a neuron, that it was something very core to basic sort of housekeeping functions of a cell. And so I think that's why we're seeing changes for a variety of different conditions in the brain because it's doing something a little bit more fundamental than just specific mechanisms that we'd look for. And there's some really good research that's come out of John Hopkins and Gul Dolan's lab about critical period that Ibogaine opens, where the brain is more able to change. And just that long window of an increased capacity to change this, unlike anything we would experience in our adult lives, allows this kind of innate healing intelligence of the body to kick in and repair different systems depending on what's needed, I think. So we still have a lot to learn, but that's why we've been able to see some really fundamental repair happening, not just in a psychological space, but in a physiological, structural change in the brain.
Yeah, so it's very complex in terms of all of the mechanisms that it's impacting. And I like the framing of these are actually natural, the cell function, the critical period. These are things that exist in us. And I began to kind of facilitating those things turning on, those things functioning better. And putting myself in your shoes, I think about we have this medicine. We're just at the beginning of our scientific understanding of it, at least through a Western scientific medical lens. And it's clearly a trans-diagnostic treatment. However, as we do, we go through the regulatory processes and so forth, which will be for single indications. We're trying to wedge this into the Western medical model. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about your thoughts about it, any concerns that you have around the risks of just those limitations.
Again, I think it's really important for us to look at factors and characteristics that we otherwise take for granted. The biggest example that I can think of is Ambio's done a lot of work with veterans. And so for most people, the conception of what veterans need support with is the trauma that comes from the experience that happened in war, the psychological experience that registers as post-traumatic stress disorder. And so when we did a collaboration with Stanford and they looked at 30 patients that came through Ambio and they showed a massive reduction in PTSD symptoms that was really immediate and very sustained over time. But all these guys also had mild traumatic brain injuries because of proximity to blasts or just high caliber weapon fire. There's lots of things that would cause movements in the head repeatedly over many years. It causes accumulation and a chronic buildup of sort of structural damage in cells. So it's hard to say by looking at the data that shows a drop in PTSD symptoms that Ibogaine treats PTSD because we don't really know that. Because again, we're looking at guys that had a very similar and very homogenous kind of experience. Even just to say that it would treat and resolve mild traumatic brain injury and cause improvements over time is still oversimplifying things because another characteristic of these guys is that they're in retirement. So they're not going back into frontline combat. So we don't know what would happen necessarily if we sent lots of people right back after Ibogaine treatment back into the front lines of combat. We don't know what it would be like to create a critical period of learning and growth and openness to change and new stimuli, and then send them back into an environment that's potentially really complicated, right? So guys are all in retirement and in a retirement into a peaceful kind of suburban lifestyle. And the other thing is that they're also, one of the challenges that they had was that they were not just like in a car accident and had traumatic brain injury and it was just a sudden impact. They had been trained intensively to do something that was a group bonded, meaning making activity that sort of defined their lives. And retirement out of that was complicated for their identities, right? So the treatment that showed in the Stanford study where there's a drop in PTSD symptoms is looking at a very narrow cross section of what's actually going on for these guys. And the situation is far more complicated. And so I think what's going to be challenging as we move it into the medical system is thinking about all of the different communities. Like veterans is interesting because it's a large community and it is a homogenous type of experience. As you go into the rest of the medical field and you try to treat people, how well can you adapt programs to be able to address all the complex situations that surround somebody's life? And I think if we try to do it too narrowly, I don't know that we're going to get the same results.
I really respect that answer a lot. It shows a level of sophistication around public health and what it means to actually bring a novel treatment like this to scale across a super diverse populations. And thank you so much for kind of orienting us around what is known and what is not known. based on some of the limitations of just who has been receiving the majority of the treatment. So what I'm hearing is that there could be many things that it treats or doesn't treat based on the individual patient's circumstances. And sounds like we have a long way to go to understand how we're going to be applying these within the healthcare system effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of questions, and what I would offer and what I would hope for is just that even though we can use measurements like PTSD or depression or anxiety and show changes in these little cross sections, that we start to think more holistically or more broadly about what's actually going on.
And some mapping, if we can think that way, then some mapping to other populations might be possible and direct the next phase of research, right? Which always needs to be happening. So we'll continue. I really like that you brought this up. I think that it's a thread that I would encourage the listeners to follow in terms of how we go from the state that we're at with the research and our understanding to bringing this to the vision that so many people are thinking about. Oh, when everyone has access to Ibogaine, there's a lot of steps between where we are now and there. And you're indicating, you're giving a little flag signal to this is a way to think about it. We want to think about it holistically, and then that's going to give us some roadmaps to where we can be applying this medicine. I want to switch gears just a little bit because I know it's very significant that you have the only Nagoya compliant export license for Ibogaine. We just saw Ibogaine in this executive order. And so that's another tension that I think we want to just hear from you about in terms of the Western world's need for speed and also the indigenous wisdom holders who steward this medicine. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about those tensions, how you think it's going, and what you would like to see happen.
Sure, there's a lot to talk about there. I think the main organization that's been driving all of the political momentum in the United States with the requisition of funds from Texas and this coalition that's forming with other states, and then all the way to the executive order and the federal funding that's being applied is Americans for Ibogaine, which is led by Rick Perry and Brian Hubbard. And they did go and engage with Gabon, I think explicitly with the intention of trying to create some sort of a reciprocity framework, but there's a little bit of hesitation and a will to try to steer the conversation away from something called the Nagoya Protocol, which is a UN treaty. It's the treaty that I have my export license through because that's how Gabon had previously structured its laws. There was an effort with AFI to try to encourage the government to look at a partnership outside of the Nagoya framework because the United States is not a signatory to Nagoya. So that language could have maybe been problematic in their advocacy efforts. But anyways, the government of Gabon on April 30th put out a decree that they essentially doubled down on Nagoya and extended their kind of scope of how they consider their strategic heritage reserve to not only Iboga, but also to Ibogaine and potentially other chemical derivatives that come from Iboga. And so there's a complex legal framework about access and benefits sharing. It's been being worked out for decades in the pharmaceutical field and in other fields as well, other sectors from food and beverages to timber and other things. Yeah, so it's complicated. And there is still a conversation that's very much in progress. So Gabon is now at the table working out the details of what that law will look like. But I think the positive framing, from my perspective, that they've doubled down on a commitment to Nagoya is that Nagoya is really set up to benefit traditional knowledge holders. And I think that's what would be culturally important for a lot of people. It's not just governments making transactions between each other, but it's actually affecting communities of people who have worked with and stewarded this plant for centuries and potentially millennium. So I think that's positive, and a lot remains to be seen about how it plays out.
Indeed. And now is the time. I've been in so many different places with different people from different backgrounds, and there's an emergence now of the need for indigenous wisdom more than ever, considering we have such pressing problems that we haven't been able to figure out. And we have people who've been living on the planet for millennia very harmoniously. So I'm very encouraged to see increasing interest around wisdom sharing and the generosity that I've witnessed from the Bwiti and the Gabonese in terms of we want the world to have this medicine. And we also want there to be fair exchange for essentially what is thousands of years of doing the original human trials so that we would even know that this medicine exists. We'll continue to track this piece around right relationship with the Gabonese and the Bwiti, absolutely. And we want to shift to Q&A because I know people want to ask you questions, but I would just love to ask you one last question. Considering that you have built this clinical infrastructure, you've written the foundational guidelines, you've authored what may be the defining book on this medicine, and you're pioneering the supply chain model. What is the version of the future that you're actually working towards? And what is the thing that could most likely get in the way of that?
What I've had the benefit of being able to participate in for the 16 years or so that I've been around Ibogaine is a very organic and bottom-up evolution about all these things, like you described, the supply chain, the clinical models, and generally like how we approach and think about the medicine, right? So I think what I'm advocating for as strongly as I can right now is that we don't cut that off in an attempt to look for sort of top-down mechanisms to now bring Ibogaine to scale. I think that it's really important that we learn how to continue to draw upon and make room for the kind of organic knowledge and wisdom that's grown up in the community. And I feel that after 16 years, I can only imagine the extent to which that sentiment is felt in Gabon as well. I know that I've personally, like the bicameral framing of the book and other elements of how we approach treatment at Ambio were things that emerged from long conversations and deep engagement with Bwiti. We don't do Bwiti tradition, but there's certain things that just take time to digest and integrate and figure out and understand. And so what I'm hoping is just that knowledge doesn't get cut off in the attempt to make it palatable for institutions.
This is something that I think is so important to keep in the conversation, keep front and center, because there are, of course, mechanisms that might do that without realizing what's being lost, right?
Yeah.
The priorities are not set up necessarily to privilege this type of relationship, this type of honoring, this type of welcoming of different types of information. And so I really just respect so much how you're holding that tension and that possibility. And really, that's what it is. It's an incredible possibility and opportunity for us to bring these medicines forward with this knowledge and with this wisdom intact.
Absolutely. Parts of the process will play out in labs and with very technical problems to solve. But I think as we'll see more and more, it's also a cultural artifact. It's a cultural discussion that's going to play out in different ways. And I don't know of any other sphere in which there will be so much influence of culture on the scientific approach. And I just hope that we are able to keep that, the whole picture intact.
Absolutely. And I'm also hopeful that we can get a bit tactical with it. We might not always need to figure out and agree upon everything up front, but we can start to find projects, find ways to just do it and then see what outcomes that we get, which I'm seeing more of that. And I hope to see those projects come to light. So let's jump to some questions from the audience, which is always great. The first question is regarding your Nagoya certification. Why are you the only Nagoya certified exporter. This participant is curious to learn more about how the process works and how the details can be disseminated, and what are some of the politics in securing that certification.
So I think it's accurate for me to say that I was the first. I don't think it's accurate for me to continue to say that I'm the only, although that might have been in the bio that got sent to you late, but that's fine. But I think there was several. However, even since we sent you that bio and set this up, there's been changes. Everything's flipping on its head every day. So the new decree from Gabon potentially could cancel out prior contracts, or they would now have to get reassessed by a different committee. It's just moved from one ministry to another ministry. And so it's likely that I'll have to reapply and update the application. It'll go towards different people than I was working with before. So as far as like how you approach it, I think it's easier for me to say we still have to wait a week or two until Gabon puts out sort of final version of the new law that it's implementing, which will clarify exactly how that works. Nagoya is implemented country by country, and so it happens in different ways. And what's happened is they've moved the focal point of Iboga from the Ministry of Forests to the Culture Ministry. And now there will be a committee that manages applications. Yeah, so I think the best answer is watch this space, and I'm going to learn as soon as you do.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So this is a very timely question then,
Yeah.
for someone to be now paying close attention, because things are shifting even within Gabon,
Yep.
even in terms of how they give these certifications.
Absolutely. And so that folks can understand a little bit more about Nagoya, it's not just about access to Iboga. Nagoya covers genetic resources, but it also covers the knowledge that surrounds the use of those genetic resources. So one of the challenges up until now has been that, well, I can have an agreement with a single community to access stuff that they grew in their farm. Making an agreement with the country of Gabon and the wide spread of different traditional practices about using traditional knowledge is a lot more complicated because you have to be able to obtain free, prior, and informed consent, which means you have to be able to fully describe the project and have an answer back. But for that to happen, there has to be almost a centralized association or something where that can speak on behalf of traditional practitioners. And there isn't one, or there hasn't been one. But the pressure that's come from not only the executive order, but the sort of slow buildup of interest in the United States and internationally has created a vacuum, and that association has been forming. So there's an organization now called Magango Manazambe, which is an association that represents all of Misoko Bwiti, which is the largest tradition. It's practiced all through Gabon and every province of the country. And the leaders and the organizers are very well connected with other traditions who are rallying under the support of that association. There was like days ago a meeting with African kings and traditionalists from even surrounding countries coming to provide support for Magango Manazambe to continue to build and generate a kind of mechanism for consensus amongst traditional practitioners. So all this is happening. I think it's all very possible. And I think I'm still very hopeful that it's going to play out in a really beautiful way and set a really beautiful precedent. But those are the kinds of complex mechanisms that I think we'll need to see still form.
Excellent. And so good to hear that the Bwiti are organizing in this way. That's going to be essential for them and for all of us. Say, thank you very much for sharing those insights. I also want to read this question from Adriana Kurtzer, who is a leading attorney in the field. Hi, Adriana. Great to have you here. What are some issues to consider related to Mexican cartels as Ibogaine becomes more popular? And you've probably had to think about this a little bit.
To be honest, I haven't thought about it too much. I think cartel influence happens differently in different areas of the country. And Ambio is located in northern Baja California, where it's certainly not void of cartel activity, but it's very specifically focused on routes of bringing fentanyl and other narcotics across the border. So there isn't a lot of interference between cartels and local businesses in any sector. So like we haven't dealt with any cartel activity. I don't know how that plays out in other parts of the country, and there hasn't been an overlap there. So I don't know exactly, but yeah.
So it really is geographic. It really is specific to where those cartels are going to insert or affect influence. And fortunately, Ambio is not in one of those locations, right?
Yeah, I
Well,
would think so. And I don't know like how that would play out in the future or where and how cartels would pose a threat to Ibogaine clinics, but I can say that I haven't seen or heard of anything to be concerned about right now.
okay. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. Good to know. And our last question is from Elizabeth McCoy. Elizabeth, great to have you with us. How do you see the intersection of Secretary Kennedy's de-prescribing initiative with the executive order accelerating emerging therapies like Ibogaine? And from a care delivery model, is there a gold standard for the number of times a patient can safely undergo an Ibogaine treatment? How would we evaluate this over time?
I'll have to first say that I don't know about the deprescribing initiative, so I don't know if I can comment on it specifically, but I can definitely say that you can't just introduce a new drug into a vacuum where like other aspects of the healthcare system are not properly aligned to support people. I think Ibogaine's not going to be the only thing that saves the day. There has to be access to generalized care. That's going to be absolutely the case with addiction recovery. There's technical concerns about being able to, for example, prescribe short-acting opiates to stabilize folks before they take Ibogaine in a clinical setting. That's going to be complicated because you can't currently prescribe short-acting opiates in the United States in that way or for that reason to stabilize somebody's addiction. You can use it for surgeries and anesthetics and pain relief in certain controlled contexts, but it's much more complicated. So I don't know if I'm answering the question because again, I don't know about the deprescribing initiative. But as far as the number of times that somebody can safely do, in our experience, I think once somebody's shown that they can tolerate Ibogaine safely, we do the same screening every time, but I don't see an upward limit where it becomes more risky if you continue to do it. If anything, we become more confident that this person understands. So, like psychologically, there's less friction and resistance going into the experience. And physically, people tend to eventually be able to tolerate it more smoothly. And so I don't know that we have an upper limit. In fact, some of the neurological treatments like Parkinson's and MS, people are doing long-term microdosing. It's still really early. Some of the patients we've worked with have, I think the longest running one that I followed was 6 years of microdosing daily. But again, there wasn't a cumulative problem that built up or additional risk over time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So you have, with Ibogaine, you have flood doses, which may end up helping people to titrate or completely get off of their daily dose medicines for some things. And then also you have a track where Ibogaine might itself become a daily dose type of medicine. So we're going to have to see how that all plays out. And it's really good to hear those initial findings around the safety in terms of the cumulative effect. And unfortunately, we are at the top of our time for today. There's a really good question from Greg Brock in the chat about how can therapists best determine who is best served with what Ibogaine offers, assuming no known contraindications are ruled out. I would say buy the book. And Greg, thank you so much for the question. We do have to wrap for today, but maybe you and Jonathan can be in touch offline, or Greg, please feel free to reach out to us here at Delphi for continuing the conversation. And that's an invitation to everyone. If you do have questions that we can answer here at Delphi for you, please be in touch. And please join us on June 3rd for our next Insight session. Jonathan, it has been such a pleasure. I have learned so much from this conversation, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thanks again, Leigh, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.